Today we will continue our discussions about glorious battles. A big question that immediately arises among citizens is, why do you call them Mongol-Tatars? It is very strange that a people are called Mongol-Tatars. There are no such self-names as Finno-Russians, for example. To clarify for those who don't understand, Mongol-Tatars is a scientific term used to designate the population of a specific area naturally. They did not call themselves that. Tatars is the name of one of the tribes that roamed along with others in the interfluve of the Anan and Karelen rivers in distant Mongolia. This is the name of one of the tribes. There were many of them: Karaites, Merkits, and others. We will never see the descendants of those Tatars because Temujin Genghis, having quarreled with them considerably, exterminated them completely. None of them remained. He was a master of genocide. But since they were very brave warriors, according to the glorious Mongolian custom, he immortalized their name, and apparently he called some of his detachments Tatars. Because these resisted so valiantly, it was important for the spirit to live on. This was very important. The Mongol-Tatar invasion was terrifying, and not only for Rus, of course, because it started from China and ended in Rus. Everyone suffered along the way. It is hard to think of territories where there were no political upheavals. When people say that there was no Mongol-Tatar invasion in Rus, and in fact, the well-known fantasist, historian Lev Nikolaevich Gumilyov, loved to express his opinion on this matter, claiming that there was such a symbiosis in Rus, such coexistence. Well, if you look at the archaeological layers of cities where the Mongols passed through, the traces of symbiosis are remarkably noticeable. For example, we can recall the textbook chronicle of Izyaslaval, which is now the Khmelnytsky settlement in Ukraine. The city was completely destroyed. Nothing alive remained. As per the good tradition of Genghis Khan, the wells were filled with corpses, and all the streets were covered with chopped skeletons, with arrows in their heads and backs. The Mongols of that time were already so overloaded with captives and loot that they didn't even bother to remove jewelry from the corpses, because there was no need, nowhere to put it, and in general, there was a wild massacre. The city was completely burned down, and it was not a small city. A small village remained in its place, and in fact, life resumed there only by the 16th century. Despite the enormous damage and impact of the Mongol invasion in the 1230s, it provided a unique opportunity for Rus. This was the first time in its centuries-long history that its vast territory was, strangely enough, free from the threat of the steppe. The threat from the Mongol-Tatars was so serious that after the 1230s, 1240s, no one seriously thought about fighting them anymore. The Mongol Khan was called Tsar in Russian chronicles, and every Orthodox Christian in places like Vyaka or the forests of Novgorod knew exactly how many Tsars there were in the world: the Byzantine Tsar, the Roman Tsar, i.e., the Holy Roman Empire, and the Mongol Tsar. And what is a Tsar? It is a Caesar, an emperor. And resisting a Caesar is useless. Rus was able to focus on internal problems, which led to intrigues, investigations, and scandals about who would finally rule internally. Meanwhile, they quietly and calmly fought the Germans in the West, fully concentrating on them, and battled with Lithuania. Sometimes Lithuania defeated Rus, and sometimes Rus defeated Lithuania. Naturally, if anyone wanted to oppose the Mongols, punitive corps would come. Terms such as Neveryuva and Dudnevarati have been preserved in Rus, referring to the punitive expeditions that came to subdue the rebellious in the mid and late 13th century, respectively. Interestingly, the commander Neveryui first came to deal with the rebellious principalities in Rus, and then fought in China, finally conquering the Celestial Empire. Thus, despite the enormous blow and suffering inflicted at the very beginning, Rus found itself included in a giant empire. Firstly, there was no point in resisting it, and secondly, it brought some element of order, at least from the steppe. Previously, threats came from the Pechenegs, Khazars, and Cumans. At any moment, border principalities could be attacked by another horde that would reach Smolensk, slaughter everything in its path, and then take thousands of captives to Crimea. It was necessary to constantly maintain some defenses and repel them more or less successfully. But now, order came from this side. The fact that at least the Russian aristocracy was included in this order is evidenced by the name of the tribute that Rus paid to the horde. Rus did not pay tribute but paid the so-called Vykhod, an internal state tax. And notably, no grand prince, no matter how successful and powerful, ever tried to claim the Tsar's crown. Meanwhile, all the chronicles unanimously recognized the Mongol Great Khan as the Tsar. This was a real state, a state tax. Unfortunately, we have very fragmentary documents about the size of the Vykhod. We do not know the exact amount that was paid overall. But it varied over the years. At the peak of the Golden Horde's power, which is correctly called the Ulis of Jochi, the state of Genghis Khan's son Jochi, later ruled by Khan Batu and so on until Tokhtamesh, with whom the story we are discussing today at the Battle of Kulikovo field occurred. During the reign of Khan Janibek in the mid-14th century, the Vykhod was at its highest in history. It can be roughly estimated that it amounted to about 4% of the gross domestic product. On the one hand, this was money that could have been kept within the country. On the other hand, now in the Russian Federation, the income tax is 13%, which immediately brings unfavorable comparisons. There it was 4%, and they were conquerors, while here it is 13% from our own. By the time of Dmitry Ivanovich Donskoy's reign, the Vykhod was almost halved through a series of international treaties. By the way, tax evasion was a crucial business for Moscow, because Ivan Kalita, the Prince of Moscow, was the first prince to say that he would collect the Vykhod from all of Rus and send it to the Horde himself. This way, they wouldn't send their Baskaks, who might get beaten, and then there would be repercussions. They might send another Nevriui, who would beat everyone. Why would we need that? So, he proposed to collect it himself. Kalita means purse. He collected the Vykhod for the Horde, and apparently did not deliver all of it. You can't hold honey in your mouth without tasting it. And this is how Moscow rose to prominence in Rus. The Khans knew that he was a reliable business partner they could deal with. Ivan Kalita made an agreement with the Khan's court that he would collect and be responsible for the Vykhod, and they gave him a command, a yarlak. They gave him a yarlak. Accordingly, no one in their right mind would resist Ivan Kalita, because again, another Nevriui would come and restore order, which was done so thoroughly that grass wouldn't grow there until the 16th century. Everyone knew this well, and therefore they tried not to quarrel unnecessarily. At the time we are discussing, the Horde was far from the splendid sight it had been under Khan Janibek and earlier. In 1359, Khan Berdi Beg was killed, and from then on, the Horde entered a period of great turmoil, essentially a civil war. Over 20 years, leading up to the Battle of Kulikovo field, more than 25 Khans were replaced, meaning some did not even rule for a year. As Russian chronicles write, Mamai placed them with his own hand. Mamai, it should be understood, was a Bigler Beg, or vizier in Persian terms, the second person in the state. But he was not a Chinggisid, and this is crucial. Even if you carefully read the phrase "placed them with his own hand," it implies that in the medieval understanding, a Tsar is placed by God, and Mamai was clearly a usurper, someone who could be fought against, because he was not a Tsar and was never called a Tsar. Although, of course, as a Bigler Beg, he was a very powerful figure, a sort of gray cardinal, and later not so gray, eventually just a cardinal who placed these young Khans, who were then killed by the next contender. There were 25 such changes, and it was a constant massacre. The Ulis of Jochi itself effectively split into two parts, the western part and the eastern part. Mamai ruled the eastern part from the capital. The Ulis of Jochi extended only to the Caspian Sea. Beyond that, other hordes existed. Then Timur came from Samarkand. First he sent Tokhtamesh, and then he came himself to finally put an end to this chaos. Mamai was in Sarai Burk, in the eastern part of the Ulis of Jochi, and he constantly tried to annex the other part of the Ulis of Jochi. Sometimes he succeeded, sometimes he didn't. This was a real civil war, very brutal. For the Mongol-Tatars, there was one pleasant and one very unpleasant fact. The pleasant fact was that they could finally do whatever they wanted, at least for a while. The unpleasant fact was that the only reliable source of constant super income, which could be used for war or luxurious living, was Rus. This Vykhod flowed into the Horde through these lands, and all these Khans, little kings, emirs and mirzas tried to control these flows. For Rus, this presented both a great opportunity and a great danger. The Ulis of Jochi had ceased to be this all-crushing force, with which it was not only dangerous to quarrel but even to look at sideways. On the other hand, with the fragmentation of the unified monolithic state, order disappeared. Now, it was like the times of the Cumans, when any more or less successful prince could gather a few thousand sabers, lead them to Smolensk, Kiev, or anywhere, burn everything, take thousands of captives, loot, and then use the proceeds to hire an even larger army and return again. Naturally, no one wanted to tolerate this. Everyone understood that paying was much more advantageous than fighting, but beyond a certain point, this payment ceased to be reasonable. In 1375, the alliance of the princes of northeastern Rus was finally formalized. This was a congress of princes in Pereyaslavl, where the main agreements were apparently reached. Unfortunately, no protocols, transcripts, or audio recordings of this congress have survived, but it seems that it was then that this alliance was finally formed, agreeing on actions against any usurpers or simply bandits from the steppe. In addition, this alliance of princes made very important internal political moves, particularly subjugating Tver. If we recall, Tver and Moscow were roughly equal on the political field in northeastern Rus. It was completely unclear who would ultimately become the Grand Prince of Vladimir, as the highest title at that time was the Grand Prince of Vladimir. But thanks to broad support from the alliance of princes, Moscow eventually triumphed and first brought Tver to submission, and later Novgorod, although that was long after the Battle of Kulikovo. Initially, there was an alliance with Novgorod within this large coalition of princes, but then Novgorod separated from it, and in 1386, after a major campaign, Novgorod was brought back into the orbit of Rus. Taking advantage of the support from such a powerful coalition, Dmitry, during another round of negotiations with Mamai, declared that he would no longer pay the large Vykhod Mamai demanded the Vykhod. From the time of Janibek, which was very large, literally twice as much as the agreement he himself signed in 1371. Mamai desperately needed money because in 1377, Timur the Lame from Samarkand had just sent Tokhtamysh, a true Chinggisid and direct descendant. It was crucial for him to finally put an end to this madness. But Mamai sent troops because he was such an arrogant beglerbeg, completely unwilling to accept the loss of power. He sent troops and defeated Tokhtamysh twice. Clever. He had to return to Timur and somehow negotiate with him. Timur sent troops with him again until he finally went himself, much later of course, but still. Mamai found himself in a situation that chess players call zugzwang, or as the Russian saying goes, either a pan or gone. On one hand, he had the Golden Horde, the Ulis of Joki, under his control, which by that time was already trying to disintegrate. Volga Bulgaria had practically seceded and needed to be brought back into submission by military force. Military force requires money. On the other hand, there was the real Chinggisid Tokhtamysh, who after winning his first serious victory, would have everyone flocking to him immediately. Mamai was tolerated only because he was indeed a very successful and fierce ruler, and people were simply afraid of him. The only place he could quickly and reliably get this money was from Rus. But Rus did not want to pay, saying they would pay the old Vykhod without question, but not the doubled amount. Mamai then initiated military actions. It is important to understand that Rus had a very ambiguous relationship with Mamai. When Mamai is portrayed as a Hitler in a skullcap, it is not accurate because, for example, Mamai facilitated the release of Metropolitan Cyprian from Lithuanian captivity and personally interceded for him. Mamai corresponded with Dmitry Ivanovich Donskoy and earlier with Metropolitan Alexius, and for a time, they reasonably negotiated international cooperation. However, this partnership eventually ended, and Mamai showed his true colors, coming to ravage and destroy. In 1377, Mamai sent his subordinate Arap Shah, known as Arapsha in Russian chronicles, and a coalition of princes, including the Nizhny Novgorod Sizdal regiments and troops, went to meet him. This led to the famous Battle of the Payana River, where, according to the chronicles, the Russian warriors got drunk before the battle and were slaughtered in the morning. The main alcoholic beverages of that time in Rus were beer and mead. Wine was also available, but was very expensive. After the victory at the Payana River, the Mongol-Tatars, following tradition, ravaged the lands of Nizhny Novgorod, invaded the lands of Ryazan, and laid waste to them. As a result, the Prince of Ryazan dropped out of the coalition. He would have liked to continue, but it must be understood that Ryazan was the eastern outpost, the first place the Mongols would come to. After one such defeat, they certainly did not want to face such devastation again. Moreover, Oleg of Ryazan fell under Mamai's influence, and when the Kulikovo campaign began, he was marked as Mamai's ally, although an ally who did nothing, at least remaining in a state of hostile neutrality, which was also not good. Mamai's next campaign followed immediately in 1378, with Mirza Begich leading the forces against the coalition of princes. At the Volga River, the coalition forces, led by Vladimir Andreevich, Prince of Serpukhov and future hero of the Battle of Kulikovo, and Dmitry Bobrock-Volinsky, a military genius from Lithuania, met them. The Mongol-Tatars were decisively defeated at the Volga River. This was the first successful repulsion of a large-scale Mongol-Tatar raid in a very long time. The coalition forces lined up on the riverbank, and Mirza Begich, a prince, moved on the other side of the river. They then retreated to allow the Mongol-Tatars to cross, and when they did, 3 cavalry regiments charged and drove them back into the river, drowning many. This was a very significant victory. Just as the Battle of Lesnia was the prelude to the victory at Poltava under Peter the Great, the Volga River was the prelude to the Battle of Kulikovo. After this, it became clear that this would not end well, and Mamai would go to the end. Diplomatic measures to resolve the conflict had ended, and war had begun. It should also be mentioned that at this time, Metropolitan Alexius, who had moved the Russian metropolitan see to Moscow and ruled Moscow during the minority of Prince Dmitry Ivanovich, the future Donskoy, died. Metropolitan Cyprian, a Bulgarian by origin, took his place. He had very complicated relations with Moscow because the Lithuanians, who controlled almost a third of Western Rus, including Kiev and Polotsk, supported him as their metropolitan. A serious political crisis arose that needed to be resolved quickly because Mamai, being experienced, did not go to war alone. He made an agreement with the Lithuanian Grand Duke Jogaila to strike the northeastern coalition from behind. Jogaila indeed went to war, negotiating under the threat of military action with Prince Oleg of Ryazan. Thus, a ring of enemies formed, from which they had to either break out or surrender. In 1380, Mamai, coordinating his actions with Lithuania, marched towards Moscow. This was an extremely dangerous moment because if Mamai had won and taken what he wanted, he would have hired more troops and returned, and Rus would not have escaped easily. It would have been devastation comparable to the times of Batu Khan. Moscow would have certainly fallen as the center of Rus for many years, and it is unknown if it would have remained the political focus of Rus. Everyone understood this well, although they did not yet know the term political focus or foresee that it would become the capital of a new kingdom. Naturally, no one wanted to surrender. Dmitry Ivanovich took swift countermeasures, made possible only because the alliance of princes had been prepared in advance. As soon as Dmitry Ivanovich learned of Mamai's advance, he announced the gathering of troops in Kolomna on August 15th. The troops gathered with incredible speed, which is very important when discussing the size of the forces, a subject of much speculation. The troops gathered very quickly. On August 23rd, Dmitry Ivanovich led the troops to the banks of the Lopaznia River, close to the Oka River, the border of northeastern Rus. Crossing the Oka, the troops entered the Great Steppe, the first time in over 150 years that Russian troops had ventured into the Great Steppe. In Zdonshchina, a literary work dedicated to the Battle of Kulikovo, it is said that when the troops left Moscow and Kolomna, everyone cheered them, but when it became known that they had crossed the Oka, the wives wept. It is not very clear to us why they wept. They did not cry when leaving Moscow, but suddenly they cried now. Did they finally understand? Yes, they did, because leading the troops into the Great Steppe was like sending them to their deaths. It was indeed extremely dangerous, because no one might return from the Great Steppe. By early September, the army set out at an incredible speed for a medieval army. They left Kolomna on August 15th, and by September 7th were already on the banks of the Don River, covering 215 miles. For a large army, and it was indeed large, this was a very fast pace. Naturally, they did not travel in a straight line, as such roads did not exist. The direct distance was 215 miles, but how much they actually traveled with detours is hard to say. This is also a very important point because only a certain type of army could move so quickly. More on that later. On September 7th, Dmitry arrived at the banks of the Don, at the confluence of the Don and the Nepriadva River, and crossed the fords to the other side, into the steppe. The location was chosen perfectly, and the place of the battle itself is worth discussing separately because it is also a subject of speculation. Many people say that it is unclear where exactly it took place. This is a very rare case in medieval history, where we know the exact location of a battle from chronicles the confluence of the Don and Dnieper rivers. The Battle of the Vosha River is unclear where it took place. The Vosha River is very large, and it could be anywhere, making it difficult to find. But here, there is a clear indication. However, if you visit the Kulikovo field today, you will see plowed fields, wheat and feather grass up to your waist, and where exactly to look, only God knows. Firstly, there is a geographical landmark, but again, the confluence of the Don and Dnieper rivers heading south from there can take you far. Where exactly it all happened, only God knows. But I will say right away that where the monument to the Kulikovo field now stands, the famous stele designed by Vaznetsov, nothing actually happened there. It was a mistake, but they simply didn't know at the time. It was all somewhat to the north, precisely as the chronicle accurately stated, the confluence of the Don and Dnieper rivers, and from there literally a mile maybe. How was this determined? The final point in this matter was made by archaeologist Oleg Dvyrikensky, who led the military archaeological team of the State Historical Museum of Moscow, conducting a continuous expedition at the Kulikovo field from 2002 to 2012, if I'm not mistaken. After a long period of collecting items from the surface using metal detectors, where the field was combed with metal detectors looking for anything, they turned to paleopedologists, a special branch of geographers who can reconstruct the landscape as it was in the 14th century. It turned out that what we have now has nothing in common with what was in the 14th century. Firstly, there was forest everywhere. The banks of the Dnieper and Don rivers were heavily forested. An old Russian word zaleshino means lots of forest. The field itself was literally riddled with ravines. If you walk there now, you see small gullies, but they have been significantly leveled by regular plowing since the 19th century. In the 14th century, during the global cooling period known as the Little Ice Age, the climate optimum of the Middle Ages 10th–13th centuries ended, and cooling began. The ravines flooded heavily in the spring and were about 3 meters deeper than they are now, around 5 to 6 meters deep. These were not just gullies but real ravines covered with forest. It was clear that not only cavalry but even infantry could not operate there. Only partisans could act there, and no medieval army could work in such conditions. There remained one plateau close to what the chronicle indicates, a place free from ravines and forest, the actual field. There, they could meet with enthusiasm, thoughtfully, and respectfully, as needed. This field is approximately 3,300 yards long and about 900 yards wide. Essentially, it is a defile between forested areas, naturally cut off at the back by the confluence of the Don and Dnieper rivers, with significant forested areas, and squeezed on the sides by forests and ravines. On one side, a small river called Smolka flows, but its steep banks were completely impassable for a medieval army during a battle. On the other side, right in the middle of this field, there is a forested tongue that archaeologists tend to call the Green Oak Grove, apparently the same Green Oak Grove where Bobrock's ambush regiment hid. If this is indeed the case, and it is now 100% clear that it is, Dmitry Donskoy and his advisors were very skilled military topographers. They positioned themselves exactly in a place that Mamai could not physically bypass because they left the fords right behind them. The next fords are about 60 miles away, making it difficult to move a significant army across. With the river behind and the lack of clear fords, it prevented the Mongol-Tatars from using their favorite tactic, leaving the enemy where they stood, moving away for a week, crossing from another side, and ambushing them on their way home. They had done this many times. On the other hand, the Mongol-Tatars were completely deprived of the advantage of their massive light cavalry with bows because the field was only 900 yards wide and 3,300 yards long the corridor. Here, they had no choice but to attack head-on, with no possibility of flanking. Additionally, the field had a slightly curved shape, like a sickle, and when the Mongol-Tatars crossed the Smolka River, they found themselves face to face with the Russians. They couldn't prepare their strike and had to react immediately upon entering the field. Mamai had no other options because, as I mentioned, he couldn't retreat, he had to fight. At this location, where it can be logically assumed the battle took place approximately in the middle of the field, where they would have met and fought, Oleg Dvyrikensky established the so-called 20-second search area, which yielded a wealth of findings. Currently, if we consider rare items found in the 19th century, items collected in the 1980s during searches for the anniversary, and the modern targeted search work of the military archaeological team from the State Historical Museum. There are about 100 items. It must be understood that such a quantity of weapons cannot simply be found in a wild field where no one lives. Additionally, besides weapons, there are several dozen crosses or their fragments, the so-called encolpions crosses worn over clothing or armor, large and expensive. Some of them are of metropolitan quality, very expensive. A gold ring with a decis was found there, although unfortunately it was discovered not by our friends, the military archaeologists, but in the late 19th century, and it was lost during the evacuation of the Tula Museum in 1941. However, the drawing of the seal remains. The fact is that a solid gold ring, which cost as much as half of a nearby village, was found there. This item was of princely quality. Additionally, 2 helmet fragments were found, indicating a real slaughter took place there because items were usually thoroughly cleaned up after a battle. What the victors did not take, the local residents certainly did. This indicates that the scale of the battle was so great that even such items were overlooked. The crown part of a helmet with a fused chainmail of entail was found, a small section, and a fragment of the forehead part with a nasal guard. Numerous arrows, fragments of axe blades, about 6 spears. I say about because there are fragments, whole spears, and butt caps, the part that decorated the rear end of the spear shaft. 1 butt cap was found. 1 whole solitsa was found. A solitsa is a throwing dart, a versatile light spear that could be thrown or used as a bayonet. Armor plates 3 or 4 pieces, 1 almost intact, which is very characteristic. Judging by its trapezoidal shape, small upper base, large lower base, it is part of the hem, the edge of the armor, which could be lost during a strong blow. A plate from the central part of the set would hardly be lost because it was secured by other plates. But the edge could easily be lost. A brass trim from a sleeve or hem of chainmail was found 7 or 8 rings, which were also likely torn off by a strong blow. Notably, for an experienced eye, this says a lot. All these items are found in clusters, 2 to 4 items in one place, 1 to 2 in another. It is clear that a serious fight took place here, with items being cut off across, a piece of armor. This is very characteristic of cavalry combat, because infantry combat leaves very different traces. Infantry combat is when 2 masses of infantry meet in one place and trample there, until the end. There should be a heap of finds or at least traces of finds. Cavalry combat is extremely mobile. In Rus, it wasn't just the Mongols who were familiar with the steppe peoples from the 10th century onwards. Rus knew well what mounted archers were, but unfortunately, such things couldn't be done just by the will of a grand prince. The Mongols were excellent archers because they were nomads. They were all natural-born riders and archers. They could shoot accurately from bows while sitting, standing, in any direction. They were trained not just for years but for generations, literally drilled. To reach such a level, a Russian professional warrior, who was also a hereditary warrior, could learn, and his son could learn, but there wouldn't be many of them. Rus couldn't make the entire army archers on par with the Mongols. Although there were bows and light cavalry, they naturally provided some support in ranged combat. There might be a question that you don't need to shoot very accurately, you just need to create a very large grouping. And maybe even the arrows should be different, not the ones that hit directly, but those that are shot in an arc, probably with some special tips, and you don't need to shoot very accurately. But here's the thing: you would be absolutely right if you were talking about foot archers. The famous English archers worked as a system of volley fire. But a foot archer has the advantage of being able to stand very closely with his comrades in 2 to 3 ranks, and when 1,000 people shoot at once, they create a very high density of fire. A mounted archer is a completely different matter. Horsemen cannot go so closely together. Therefore, when this wave of archers advances, they send arrows forward towards the enemy, then suddenly turn around, start to retreat, and, turning in the saddle, shoot in the other direction. This creates a certain massing effect. But because they are quite spread out, each horseman must also be able to aim, especially at full gallop, otherwise it will be absolutely useless. Even today in Mongolia, there are ethnographic competitions in horseback archery, where archers hit the bottom of a bucket from 55 yards at full gallop. Hitting the bottom of a bucket from 55 yards with a bow is something not everyone can do, even standing firmly on the ground. And you also have to control the horse, which periodically throws you up during the gallop, and you sway in all directions. Do they have some kind of built-in gyroscopic stabilizer or something? God knows. Moreover, the bows are very powerful, on average more powerful than any European bow. It is known that the famous English archers had so-called marksmen, elite shooters in the line, with bows that had a draw weight of 130 to 175 pounds. But these were very rare people. The average bow had a draw weight of about 45 pounds, and it was just a simple stick. The Mongolian bow, however, is a weapon of victory because it is a reflex composite bow. Reflex means that when the string is released, it bends forward with its limbs. When drawn, it forms an S-shaped structure, with the limbs acting as levers. This means that even though the bow has a very high draw weight, the load on the string is much less. Such a design has been known since antiquity, but Persian and Turkic bows are very expensive because they have a large number of additional parts made of bone, horn, and glued tendons. The Mongols managed to simplify and cheapen this weapon as much as possible while maintaining its combat qualities. It remained very powerful and became absolutely widespread. According to the Yasa of Genghis Khan, every Mongol carried 2 bows and 2 quivers with 30 arrows each, plus spare bowstrings. At any moment, even if one bow broke, the other was still available and could be used. Therefore, the Mongols were the most dangerous enemy Rus ever faced. Up until the 17th century, the Russians continued to pay them tribute simply because fighting them was more costly than paying the tribute. Although, of course, things looked different in later times, it was still more advantageous to buy them off because this massive force of steppe cavalry was a very formidable weapon at that time. What could Rus oppose? They had their own archers, of course, although not as good as the Mongolian ones and not in such numbers. They could counter with heavy cavalry, because at that time, the Russian druzhina and regiments were primarily cavalry, and primarily heavy cavalry, which was formed around the boyars. A boyar was the direct functional equivalent of a European knight, who brought with him a military corporation, that is, his family, his relatives, his combat servants, what was later called combat serfs, people directly dependent on him. They probably formed up together because I can't imagine this familial Russian system working any other way on the battlefield. They probably formed up together in these corporations, several corporations thus forming a kind of cavalry squadron, and 3, 4, 5 cavalry squadrons formed a regiment. For example, the Moscow City Regiment consisted of 3 to 4 boyar squadrons. The armament of the Russians at this time was very heavy. If you look at seals, not book miniatures or icons, which could fall under the influence of iconographic canon, although it's not that simple. If you look at the seal of Dmitry Ivanovich Donskoy, you see a warrior clad in a full long-sleeved chainmail, with stylized chainmail stockings. And on top of all this, a kind of plate armor. This is a real European knight, dressed, of course, very archaically for Europe at that time, as Europe had advanced very far in the development of personal protective equipment. But still, the type of armor was the same. At this time in Rus, chainmail was almost completely out of use as the main element of protection, replaced by heavy scale armor. Helmets were made very deep, with 3/4 protective headgear that protected the head below the temples. Shields, spears were exactly like European ones, about 8 to 12 inches for the blade, mounted on a powerful faceted socket, with a shaft thickness of 1-1.5 inches, capable of piercing a person through and pinning someone else behind them if we mean a direct spear clash. The Mongol-Tatars, on average, were less well-armed in this respect. If they were the best archers on average, they were weaker as heavy cavalry, because the typical armor of a Mongol-Tatar heavy rider at this time was chainmail. Therefore, they needed to be brought to a direct frontal clash, which required steel nerves and bronze testicles. I can't put it any other way, sorry. A typical burial of a Mongol-Tatar commander, apparently, is in the Voronezh province, in the Olen Kolodez Kurgan. The man is wearing a belt made of silver gilt plaques with deep embossed reliefs depicting leopards. This is all silver and gold, and it looks amazing. The plaques are quite large, about 1 inch in size, and they are displayed in the State Hermitage Museum in the Archaeology Department for everyone to see. Additionally, he has a Prussian axe, which is imported from Prussia and also decorated with gold. There is a silver bowl with embossed and gilded work, of fantastic craftsmanship, probably from Samarkand. As for his armor, this remarkable person has an open helmet with a solid oven tail that does not cover the throat from the front, and chainmail, that's all. It should be understood that for this belt, he could have bought any armor, and not just one set. He could have traded 1 plaque for it. but he is armed like this. He also has a bow, an imported axe, and a light three-sided spear, primarily designed against chainmail. Another typical burial is in Kharka, in Crimea, near the village of Kharka-Kurgan. It has the same set of armor plus iron bracers. Apparently, some number of warriors were required to have plate armor, but there weren't many of them because it was expensive and, most importantly, not very convenient for an archer. No matter how well you make plate armor, it primarily restricts movement in the chest area, which is crucial for an archer because using a bow always involves wide movements, especially on horseback when you need to turn in all directions. Therefore, in the Mongolian army, iron armor was worn by commanders of the rank of decurion and above, and possibly some guard units. It's not very clear how many there were, but it's clear that on average, it was light cavalry. So, when the Russians faced them on the field, it's very hard to say what happened. Russian sources write, but these are literary sources, narratives, and often late ones like the tale of the Battle of Mamai, which is from the 1530s, or the China, which was produced in the early 15th century. It's still unclear who quotes whom. The tale of Igor's campaign quotes the China or the China. Quotes the tale of Igor's campaign. These are absolutely interrelated monuments, where, as I mentioned about the cento paraphrase method of text formation, it's just a mix of quotes back and forth. These are not accounts of how the battle took place, but about its significance. They are not frontline reports. The dry chronicle sources say that he came and conquered, that's it. They describe how the army moved, where it crossed the Don, and the composition of the participants is described in one way or another. The composition of the participants is not clear at all, because, for example, the commander of the left-hand regiment is called Prince Gleb of Bryansk, but excuse me, he had been dead for about 15 years by that time. By the way, it is mentioned that 70 boyars from Ryazan fell. Even though Ryazan at that time was not planning to participate in this whole affair, it was simply a direct opponent. The fact is that in the 16th, 17th centuries, it was common to attribute one's ancestor as a participant, and even better, as one who died at the Battle of Kulikovo. This was done to enhance one's status in the Mesnichestvo system. It was very honorable to have an ancestor who died at the Battle of Kulikovo. Therefore, Russian sources now count 400 fallen boyars. 400. For the Grand Duchy of Moscow, this would have been a catastrophe. There would have been no one left. The boyars would have been killed with a surplus. Considering that these accounts were written 200 years later, it's like writing about the War of 1812 today, without having the knowledge or scientific apparatus, and also boasting that my great-great-grandfather was killed there. My great-great-grandfather was even cooler. Therefore, we don't know much about the commanders. It's clear that there were key figures, so to speak, of this coalition. The main organizer was Dmitry Ivanovich, the future Donskoy, his direct relative Vladimir Andreevich of Serpukhov, and of course the military genius Dmitry Bobrak-Volinsky, who had colossal military experience. No other Russian prince of that time had anything comparable because he was the only one among them who had already fought the Mongol-Tatars. Specifically, he participated in the Battle of Blue Waters in 1362, when the Lithuanian troops of Prince Olgerd defeated the army involved in a private feud, which is what we call a private raid. Just like Dmitry Ivanovich in 1380, they decided not to tolerate it, went out, and defeated them. Bobrak participated in that battle. A true veteran of hotspots, he participated in the Livonian Wars. He was everywhere. He was an experienced warrior, and I think, of course, this is my speculation, absolutely unfounded except for indirect data, that he was the tactical genius who planned and organized all this. I just don't see any other candidates. I don't see who else could have planned such a thing. It requires colossal experience because to lead a medieval army 215 miles from the city without any support bases so that it doesn't scatter, get lost, die from diseases, or overindulge along the way, there was a precedent for this 3 years earlier. To lead it precisely to the point, just when Mamai arrives, not a day earlier or later, to skillfully arrange everything in the field, to withstand the archery barrage that the Mongol-Tatars inevitably delivered, to endure it until they are forced to go on a decisive offensive. It's clear that if you are being shot at with arrows, the cavalry cannot stand still. Cavalry is not that kind of troop. It either flees in panic or advances. So the cavalry must advance to win. The Mongol-Tatars send archers through this defile as they usually do. They need to be driven away, because otherwise, they will shoot all your horses. The regiments must advance, maybe not all at once, maybe in turns, in some kind of echelon. Well, the main step tactic of the Mongol-Tatars is to feign retreat. When the heavy cavalry chases after them, it loses formation, and then you lead them into the strike of your own heavy cavalry. Then the light cavalry turns around, envelops from the flanks, and the story takes a sad and tragic turn. Therefore, it was necessary to gallop forward but not lose formation. When this wave of archers recedes, bring everyone back in full order. This requires coordination available to a person with the education level of the General Staff Academy. But it's clear that there was no such academy then. All military knowledge was passed from father to son, from grandfather to grandson, within the corporation. This was purely oral knowledge. There was not a single military statute. Who could have done this? I think only Bobrok, of course. The configuration of the field can help us understand how the troops were arranged. The number of people can also be estimated from the field's configuration, as it was 900 yards wide where the cavalry could be deployed. If we consider the length of a deployed cavalry squadron from 1812, each horse would take up about a yard of frontage, standing stirrup to stirrup. In 1812, a squadron was strictly built in 2 ranks, with about 1.5 horse lengths between the ranks. Incidentally, on horseback, this is easily determined. As they joke in the stables, you need to see the hooves of the rider in front of you between your horse's ears. Clearly, seeing the hooves of the horse in front between your horse's ears means there are 1.5 horse lengths, making alignment very convenient. But a 2-rank squadron is a product of high civilization and rigorous drill culture. Horses had to be trained from a young age, and riders subjected to strict drill exercises month after month. Then a squadron, as the heir to the theorizing and practice of Frederick the Great, could be built in 2 ranks, which is maximally efficient, of course. In the Middle Ages, we don't see this. The depth of formation ranged from 6 to 20 rows deep, and Russian troops, like many others, traditionally divided large numbers of personnel into 3 parts. This is, firstly, triadic, which is very characteristic of medieval consciousness to form in 3s, and secondly, it is maximally convenient for management. It's clear that you have separately acting left flank, right flank, and center. This is something that can really be managed, something that is immediately visible on the battlefield by the banners, something that can be controlled with the primitive command system of the Middle Ages. And these regiments were apparently formed into something like squadrons, with 200 or 300 or 400 people each. We can't say exactly how many there were. Some were boyar retinues accustomed to fighting together. Clearly there were separate princely retinues, which could be part of, for example, the Moscow Regiment or the Vladimir Regiment, and these princely retinues could stand together. All these squadrons were built in 2, 3, maybe 4 lines, meaning these were not lines of riders but lines of squadrons. There could be several of these lines. Again, 16th century sources tell us about a much more complex and impossible division for that time, where the vanguard regiment, which found the Mongol-Tatars, was followed by the forward regiment, then the classic 3-part phalanx left hand, great regiment, right hand, with a private reserve in the form of the reserve regiment, and also the ambush regiment behind. That makes 7. This is practically impossible in the Middle Ages. We don't know of any such battle in all of Europe where the army was divided like this, and the terms great, right, and left hand appear in the 16th century, maybe the late 15th. Therefore, this is the transfer of data contemporary to the 16th century chronicler to earlier events, which, in his understanding, could not look any different. Apparently, there were exactly 3 regiments. As we see in the Battle of the Vosges, we see 3 regiments attacking the Mongol-Tatars with spears. Here, we were probably dealing with something similar. Regarding the Genoese infantry, there was no Genoese infantry there, and there couldn't have been. Firstly, the Genoese infantry were crossbowmen. This was the most common and primary weapon, crossbowmen. We don't see a single crossbow bolt there at all. Secondly, where could Mamai have gotten Genoese mercenaries? In Crimea. The contingents there were small, 100 people, 70 people, 200 people. Of course, these 200 people could have given 100 to Mamai out of generosity. But why? What difference would these 100 people make? Especially in the steppe, where you need to move quickly and maneuver. The Russians didn't have infantry either. because the nature of the army's actions, rapid marches over long distances, indicates that it was entirely a cavalry force, with spare horses necessarily brought along. There were at least 2 horses per person, a war horse used only for fighting and a marching horse used for travel, and usually there was more than one, with wealthier individuals having 1 to 2 extra horses. Riding a war horse on a march, it can easily break its leg before you even get anywhere. That's a tragedy. You're immediately rendered combat ineffective and might as well turn around on your marching horse and head home, because you won't have anything to fight on. Taking an unprepared horse into battle is suicide. It's like going somewhere in a tank without a gun or without tracks. The number of troops is also a subject of colossal speculation, because we know from sources that the speculations began almost immediately. We know that there were 500,000 Mongol-Tatars, 500,000 just to make it seem impressive. Others say 300,000. Well, where did 500 come from? This is just to say the Mongol-Tatars had 500,000, and the Russians had 70,000, and therefore it's impressive. We have several methods of calculation. Firstly, the depth of the field. How many riders can be placed in the described 3-part formation? Oleg Dvorokensky, who measured everything there manually with a tape measure based on the formation of a well-drilled squadron, stirrup to stirrup, from the early 19th century or World War I, assumes that one squadron in width is 55 to 65 yards, which is 50 to 60 riders across the front and 2 deep. He says that a maximum of 7,000 people could fit there. But he is based on the absolutely false premise that they were also built in 2 ranks. They could not have been built in 2 ranks, at least 5 to 6 at a minimum. Therefore, purely geometrically, significantly more people could fit there, 10,000 or 12,000. But I can immediately say that such a number was not there, because the second calculation method comes into play: the data on the horde tribute that Rus paid. There is a preserved agreement on how much the Grand Duchy of Vladimir paid in 1371. When Dmitry Ivanovich negotiated a reduction in tribute, they paid a ruble per soka. A soka is not a plow, but a measure of area, roughly equal to 500 chedverts. A chedvert, I remind you, is approximately 1.38 acres. They started paying a ruble for 2 sokas, so they paid half as much. The Grand Duchy of Vladimir paid 5,000 rubles, so you can calculate that 2,500 sokas multiplied by 500 is 1,250,000 chedverts. If we take a much later system of army recruitment, for example, the Novgorod system of the 16th century, 1 rider per 100 chedverts, it turns out to be 12,500 riders. But this is not the mobilization capacity. By no means. This is the upper limit of the economic base from which the army could be recruited. But such an army, and even slightly larger, began to be recruited only under Ivan the Terrible, when the pomesty system was finally formed, when landlords with attached peasants were settled on these chedverts, and they were obliged to serve the peasants to the landlord, and the landlord to the Tsar. It was then that the army significantly increased, which is associated with the great military successes of Russia at that time. In the 14th century, the recruitment system was different, much less organized. But even in the 16th century under Ivan the Terrible, and not only under Ivan anywhere, as long as the feudal system of army recruitment existed, we do not know of a single example in history where it went smoothly. It was always disrupted. So any feudal mobilization, I can immediately say, I, the king, declare a feudal mobilization. The intercept plan will not work. I can tell you that for sure. So 12,500 riders from Vladimir never. The Grand Duchy of Moscow paid 960 rubles, which amounts to 480 sokas or 2,400 riders. But again, that's what could be supported, actually less. And if we calculate our entire beautiful coalition, it could support about 30,000 riders. That's just to support them, actually much less. Plus, we immediately removed the Ryazan and Nizhny Novgorod principalities from the coalition, which suffered terribly during the raids of 1377 to 1378. We also need to remove all, or at least partially, the principalities from the western part of Rus. Because let's not forget, at this time, Jogaila was sneaking up from behind, so at least a garrison had to be left at home. And if the entire army that came to the Don field was 10,000 people, that's a monstrous number. It's just a monstrous number. In the history of the developed Middle Ages, Rus did not know such mobilization. It was a grand campaign. When we now reduce from 100,000 or 35,000, which the respected Anatoly Nikolaevich Kirpichnikov counted in 1980, simply not having the data of paleogeography, which at that time no one had done yet, he simply could not foresee the future, so I'm not even trying to criticize. I'm just stating objective facts that this was not available then, now it is. Just as the exact data on the Horde tribute were not widely published then, now we know them. People who talk about 500,000 troops always make me, as a former military person, wonder what they eat, where they live, how they are fed on the march, and how they are fed at home. It just can't be. Imagine what 10,000 is like. Have you ever seen 10,000 people in one place, so you could take them all in at a glance? Only at rock concerts. Again, how many of those people do you see at once when you're inside a rock concert? Much fewer. Well, if you're in the band Metallica standing on stage, then yes. And you need to imagine that each one is on a horse, and each has at least one more horse trotting behind, and there's some servant or serf with them, probably more than one. Plus, if we take the late 16th century records, which were probably similar in the 14th century, one cart for every 5 riders. So that's 2,000 carts and another 2,000 horses. That's a minimum of 20,000 horses plus 2,000 more in the supply train. That's 22,000 horses. Again, you need to understand, a horse can always eat, and it must always eat because it's a ruminant. But a war horse can't survive on grass alone, it needs to be fed oats all the way. So you need to imagine an army consisting, for example, of 30,000 horses moving along the road, stretched out. Well, what is 30,000 and what is a horse that's 6 meters? 30,000 horses, well, okay, they go in 2 ranks, 15,000. Multiply 15,000 by 6. If this army is moving on a march, the normal pace of a medieval army, and by the way, even a modern one on foot, is about 15 miles a day. So when your vanguard sets up camp, your rear guard is just breaking camp. And there's no radio. This can only be managed by sending a messenger. A messenger, of course, rides much faster than the army. But if something happens to the vanguard while it's setting up camp, informing the rear guard that they shouldn't go there anymore is not easy. I once saw 150 horses in one place. Even that herd is impressive, but here we're talking about 30,000 horses. That's colossal, of course. And it's clear why Lev Nikolaevich Gumilyov was absolutely right, because despite his wild imagination, he was incredibly observant and very witty. As he said, the regiments of Muscovites, Serpukovians, Dmitrovites, Vladimirites, Suzdalites, and so on came to the Kulikovo field, but Russians left. Well, yes, because no one had ever seen anything like it, especially since it ended in a brilliant victory, with the Mongol-Tatars being utterly defeated. This marked the end of Mamai's star, and as a result, Tokhtamysh took the throne as Tsar. To feed a medieval army was a punishment in itself because everything around would be burned, all the firewood that could be burned would be gone. As practice shows, when Napoleon's corps, which was about 10,000 men, came to a place and settled, there wouldn't be a yard left around. Within 2 days everything would be burned. First they would take firewood from all the peasant huts, and then they would dismantle the huts for firewood because you can't just light a fire in the forest to cook and dry things. You can't just gather fallen branches, you need dry firewood. Otherwise, even in summer, it's not very convenient to be on a march without heat. You could catch something nasty, get kidney problems, and so on. And so the Russians see such an army. I'll jump ahead, we don't know how many Mongol-Tatars there were. There are no reliable data to judge this, but the number was very impressive, because if it had been even slightly less impressive, Mamai wouldn't have behaved so boldly. He felt he had a very strong force behind him, and was firmly convinced that he could at least win. I think he was confident that he would win because, after all, these were the Mongol-Tatars, an almost invincible army with thousands of victories behind them. For a military person, confidence in belonging to a corporation that only wins is a great thing, of course. Naturally, they were confident they would win. But as sources say, 8/9 of the army was lost. Again, you need to divide the data by 10, but the defeat was, of course, fantastic and terrible. At this time, and specifically under these conditions, that is, during a distant field campaign, the infantry guarded the supply train. These were ordinary supply train servants, what is called pages in European terms. Yes, this was the infantry, but there was no place for infantry in the field at all. What was infantry at this time? It was a kind of urban militia, what was later called posashny people, that is, peasants recruited from the plow. They were recruited for quite specific purposes in auxiliary force, someone to dig ditches, clean field latrines, and build some engineering structures as needed rear troops. They were not used in battle. Remember the painting morning on the Kulikovo field? It's beautifully painted, showing men in kaftans with working axes peeking out at the approaching Mongol-Tatar horde. If they had been brought out into the field like that, you could have brought out 50,000 of them. They would just be fodder for arrows. People without serious protective armor and good drill training against a massed archery attack are just targets because on foot they can't catch up with the horse on which the Mongol-Tatar rider is riding, and what will protect them from arrows. They aren't ninjas who can catch everything with their hands. That doesn't happen. So they would all be dead. And why would the warrior class, the drushiniks and boyars, want these people to die, just like that, for no reason? These are the people who feed them, shoe their horses, repair walls, and so on, useful people doing their jobs. In principle, they could fight during a siege. Yes, and why would they need to? Moreover, it was the city dwellers who might have had some armor hidden away, because even when you're on the wall, it's better to have some armor than none at all. There's a very specific historical example of what happens when such a militia ends up in the field, known to us through archaeology, which is something that can't be interpreted. It's just a fact. In 1361, around the same time as the Battle of Kulikovo, at least in the same historical period. There's an island called Gotland, and on Gotland, there's a city called Visby. In 1361, the Danes tried to capture it. There was a king, Valdemar IV Atterdag, a wild aggressor who fought a lot with Sweden, and he decided to capture Swedish Gotland and landed there with a professional mercenary knightly army. And from all over the island, of course, the militia flowed into the city, because it's very convenient to defend in the city. There are powerful stone walls, and it's generally hard to take. And these were Swedes, Gotlanders, who had a very old Viking tradition, where every man had some relation to military affairs and had some armor. And when this militia reached Visby, the townspeople did something very bad. They closed the gates and left them all in the field one-on-one with Valdemar and his gang. The professional army slaughtered this militia in literally an hour, and slaughtered in the full sense of the word. In the early 20th century, archaeologists uncovered 4 ditches with 1,187 corpses. By medieval standards, that's 1,187 healthy men killed. It's a literal Armageddon. And they were slaughtered, and there are no signs of battle, just signs of a massacre when a person has 3 to 4 axe cuts in the back of the head. It's clear that they were knocked down and just killed. And no fragmentary armor saved them. Many corpses were thrown in right in their armor. They didn't even bother to take it off. Because it's the second half of the 14th century, and there are even armors from the 13th century. It's wild archaic. They were thrown in just like that. But I'm saying 1,187 corpses. That's what happens when a militia of craftsmen and peasants clashes with a professional army. In general, quite expectedly. The Mongol-Tatars were not allowed to use their most advantageous weapon, light cavalry archery. The Russians withstood the attack skillfully. They chose a place where the Mongol-Tatars couldn't escape, at least not strategically. Tactically, I'm sure they made some retreats. But strategically, they were forced to engage in direct combat with the Russians sooner or later. Here, the Russians were able to leverage the charge of their monolithic regiments of heavy lance cavalry, where they had a certain advantage. Even if the Mongol-Tatars were significantly more numerous, in direct confrontation, light cavalry has very little chance against heavy cavalry of the knightly type. Regarding the ambush regiment, this green oak grove, reconstructed using paleogeographic methods, is located roughly in the middle of the field. So theoretically, it was possible to stand there, wait for the battle to move forward on the Russian side, come out from behind and deliver a decisive blow, because a rear attack on a medieval army fully engaged in battle is almost a guaranteed rout, on the one hand. On the other hand, I personally have serious doubts about the plausibility of such a scenario. I don't have clear indications that it didn't happen, but I have my doubts because it's September, not winter, and it's quite bright. Hiding people in armor in the forest, and there wouldn't be just 50 people, but at least several hundred, 500 or 600 or 700 people. It's impossible to hide them there because any sunlight hitting well-polished armor would immediately create reflections and glints. These aren't people in camouflage. This all seems doubtful to me for another reason. An attack on horseback in a heavy cavalry formation only makes sense in a certain orderly formation. Heavy cavalry doesn't attack in a loose formation, it immediately loses half of its advantages. And there's no place to form cavalry in the forest, it's impossible to form it there. The ambush regiment would have had to hide in the forest, lie low, and wrap themselves in fir branches like elves. This is an oak grove, oak branches. Yes, it seems that oaks did indeed grow there, and oaks don't grow densely. They would have had to somehow manage to hide, then come out of the forest and form up. The Mongol-Tatars, of course, would have been waiting all this time and stubbornly not noticing them, and then deliver a blow to the back. Well, if it's a crowd like the one shown in the movie Gladiator, then why not they can be attacked by cavalry in a loose formation? No problem. They are absolutely helpless against a cavalry charge, especially in such a crowd. Because a single horse, galloping at 25 miles per hour, it's like being hit by a car. With a rider, that's 1,100 to 1,200 pounds. If it hits you in the back, it doesn't even need to strike you with a sword or anything, that's enough. It won't be pleasant, for sure. I was once knocked down by a horse, I still remember it. Yes, dealing with the bodies there is very complicated, considering that the field has been thoroughly searched. Of course, there's still a lot to search, as these are vast areas, and the expedition consists of 25 to 30 people. What can they do? They measure the soil for abnormal concentrations of various chemicals that are released during decomposition. But they haven't found anything so far, for which I have three explanations: a normal one, a moderately normal one, and an absolutely fantastic one. And it's unclear which one is more plausible. First, the surroundings of Kulikovo field before 1360, around 1359, before the start of the Great Troubles when the Civil War began, were quite populated. There were several villages that have been archaeologically discovered. People lived there for a long time, and they had cemeteries and churchyards. The fallen warriors could simply be taken to a churchyard. Even if it was abandoned, it was still a Christian cemetery where they could be buried. Of course, all the noble boyars, and especially the fallen princes, were taken home without question. This was not even up for discussion, because not only was the prince killed, but not returning his body to his family was beyond the pale. All the chronicles that exist and have been preserved unanimously speak about this. However, the significance of this battle was not immediately recognized by our Russian ancestors, despite it being a grand battle. It seems everyone was very happy, but its true significance began to be understood only by the end of the 15th and into the 16th century, when Moscow had already become the capital of a large kingdom. Then they remembered, when did it actually start being the capital? It started back then. This was the unifying moment, the trigger that set the direction for the Moscow Tsardom, which later became Russia, where Russians have the honor of living to this day. This was on September 8th, 1380. Regarding the tribute, despite the victory, the payments continued until 1472 or 1479, essentially until the reign of Ivan III, who finally ended the dependence on the horde in 1480 during the standoff on the Ugra River, exactly 100 years later. Moreover, for example, the Battle of Blue Waters, which I mentioned, where Algirdas defeated the Mongol-Tatar Mirzas who had undertaken a private raid, he continued to pay tribute afterward because everyone understood perfectly well that even if you repelled a raid, and it was a private initiative of some illegal band formations, if you stopped paying, a regular army would come, and it wouldn't end well. Even the very powerful Lithuania at that time, which was indeed one of the most powerful political actors in Eastern Europe, did not dare to break these tributary relations with the horde. The same was true for Rus. Moreover, when Dmitry Ivanovich Donskoy, feeling his strength, tried something similar with Tokhtamysh 2 years later, that is, with a legitimate Chinggisid Tsar, it ended with Tokhtamysh coming and burning Moscow. Despite it being almost completely surrounded by stone walls and armed with cannons by that time, which didn't help, and notably, the entire coalition of princes just scattered, no one went to fight. Just recently, in 1380, they all stood together and defeated Mamai. But as soon as a legitimate Tsar appeared, they left Dmitry Ivanovich and Vladimir Andreevich of Serpukhov to deal with it on their own. And they fled, one to Tver and the other to Voloklamsky to gather militias and their boyar regiments. By the time they arrived, it was too late. Moscow had been burned. and they had to establish relations with Tokhtamysh through diplomacy. Absolutely, the Battle of Kulikovo was indeed a pivotal moment in the unification of Russia, particularly around Moscow. Moscow emerged as the main organizer of this coalition and the battle itself. Later, in 1386, this same coalition subdued Novgorod, showing their regular cooperation and military ventures. They defeated the Mongol-Tatars twice at the Battle of the Vozha River and the Battle of Kulikovo. They also brought Tver to submission, at least for that time, and later dealt with Novgorod in the 15th century, as it was rebellious. This coalition was a real, functioning alliance that laid the foundation for the entire Tsardom, with Moscow at its center. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this modern perspective on historical events using a dialectical approach and interesting facts supported by archaeological findings, please subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. In the comments, let us know which other battles or events you'd like to hear about, perhaps the Crusades, the Viking Age, or other battles of Rus. There's a lot of exciting content ahead.